So thanks for coming, and we are going to be recording this talk, and we're also streaming this to other offices. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dorothy Dankel, who is going to speak to us on how to save the oceans with data. It's my pleasure to have her here.
Yeah. Thanks, Laura. Thanks for the invitation to come here. I have some cool stuff to show you guys, and I'm looking forward to see the reaction to it, because I have a very ambitious title, How to Save the Ocean with Integrated Assessments. I think I first will introduce myself a little bit. I come from Indiana, so I'm a Hoosier, but I've lived the last 14 years in Norway. I did my master's and PhD in fisheries biology and management at the University of Bergen in Norway. My husband's Norwegian, and our two daughters are Norwegian Americans. We're here in Boston. We've been here the past year. My husband has had a fellowship at Joslin Diabetes Center. And the last year I've been working from home on my Norwegian projects and meeting up with as many people in my network as possible while I'm stateside. And so now it's kind of fun to be here. I am a postdoc researcher at the Institute of Marine Research in Bergen, Norway. Bergen is on the west coast of Norway in the fjord country. And we're the best funded research institution in Norway. So we've been doing science there for over 100 years. I'm also at the Center for the Study of the Sciences and the Humanities at the University of Bergen. I work there 30% at the moment, where I work with philosophers, anthropologists, social scientists on areas of ethics and biotechnology and these type of things. So that's really fun because I see a lot of ways to apply that back to fisheries and helping save our ocean. I'm the chair of the European Working Group Maritime Systems the past 3 years, and I'm also a board member on the Nordic Marine Think Tank. So that's a handful of affiliations, which means that I get a lot of ideas from a lot of different places. And it's really fun to kind of put those together for a common theme, and that is saving the ocean. The first question I want to put forward is one that I think most people here could relate to. What if we understood interactions of humans with ecosystems? This humans and how they interact with ecosystems is something that is kind of a broad topic. When I was at Laura's cabin in New Hampshire, we started talking about how Google uses that term ecosystem and what does that mean, and how, as a biologist, how we use that term ecosystem. Here's a graphic that our institute commissioned, which is showing the Barents Sea ecosystem. The Barents Sea is the sea in the very north of Norway, shared with Russia. This is different than the Bering Sea, which is off the coast of Alaska. This is the Barents Sea. And here you see an idealized type of picture of the ecosystem. So you have, for example, the polar bears in the Arctic, the big land mammals, and then you have the ocean mammals, and then you have the different species of fish in the different parts of the water column. And here you have cod. The Norwegian Northeast Atlantic cod is the largest cod stock in the world. Last year, the fishing quota was 2.2 billion pounds, over a million metric tons, which is a very different cod stock than the ones found off the coast of Georgia's Bank in here, which collapsed in the 90s and hasn't really come back ever. So we have a plenty of fish and lots of fish that we harvest in Norway. But the big question is how we as humans interact with these ecosystems. When we talk about ecosystems, we can't forget about the human connection. And because humans are, in exploited parts of the sea, the biggest driver, it can be the biggest driver of mortality in the ecosystems. So what I'm going to talk a little bit today is I'm going to outline the problem of how to save the ocean, how to manage the ocean sustainably, and give you a little bit of background on that, and then start looking for some solutions, some biosocioeconomic models that I have quantified for the Barents Sea, the use of data, and the potential for collaboration across from government institutions, across from the politics of governments, and getting in private foundations and enterprises into the game. The issue here is how can we sustainably manage the ocean? And I'm going to go into a little bit of philosophy first, because I think in order for us to really examine the problem, it's really nice when we can look at people who have really examined science, because that's what we're talking about in the beginning. So I don't know if people are familiar with the Thomas Kuhn cycle. Thomas Kuhn is a philosopher of science from, this book was published in 1962. And this is the Kuhn cycle of science. And this is science with a big S, a very generic view of science. So this can be applied to any part of science. But when you start in the normal science paradigm, you start with science as a puzzle-solving entity, right? So you have problems and you have puzzles and you're trying to solve it. In this paradigm cycle, you get to what's called model drift. And that's when you're less able to solve problems using the models and the data that you have. Now, getting into a little bit of French philosophy, Ivan Illich, who was active in the 19th century, has some interesting ideas of why you would actually get model drift. There's two books that I want to point out, Deschooling Society and Tools for Conviviality, which is really interesting. I'm just going to put this problem that he puts forth to you. He starts out with the institutionalization of education. We know this from centuries. We've institutionalized how we educate people, which gets into the institutionalization of society, which gives power to the technocratic elite. This means that if you go to a school where you learn certain techniques that are used for policy, for example, this becomes a very technocratic exercise. But science becomes power. Science becomes how we make decisions. And if you get that, you can be stealing the power of the citizens' practical knowledge. This becomes relevant in resource management, because in resource management, we deal with stakeholders. We deal with our fishermen. We deal with the producers on shore. We deal with consumers. And this is an example of some Florida fishermen who are protesting some science coming from NOAA in the recreational fisheries. They're protesting that it's a very hierarchical system. Their livelihoods are based on the fishing quotas. The fishing quotas are based on the stock assessments, and the stock assessments can only be run by these technocratic elite scientists. So this is an interesting framing of the problem of model drift. So after model drift, we get to model crisis, where we see that all of a sudden our methods don't work. In a fisheries perspective, this has been outlined in the literature. Here's one article from Science stating the alarming trends in the world's fisheries demand a fundamental change in management and fishing practices. Another paper points to the lack of an integrated solution to the complexity in managing wild resources, and we have not achieved that integrated solution. Of course, an integrated solution must be based on integrated data. There's really no other way around that. And so then the next step is model revolution. But there's a famous fisheries biologist in Washington, University of Washington. His name is Ray Hilborn. And he points to the fact that managing fisheries is managing people, right? We don't manage fish. We manage fishermen. And here he says that, I believe rocket science have it easy. The USA was able to put a man on the moon within a decade of setting that goal. Achieving biologically and economically sustainable fisheries has proven more elusive. He even alludes to the idea of physics envy, right? So with physicists and pure mathematicians, they're able to have their experiments with closed variables and actually run them and get results. With ocean management and fisheries, we don't have that luxury. We have to deal with not only the vastness of the ocean, but the complexity of the human dimension, because it's the humans who are fishing and the humans who are running the models, giving the scientific advice. So in the Kuhn cycle, the next step is model revolution. And this happens when you figure out what you really need. In a fisheries perspective, this is a systems view. Now, there's three parts of the fishery system. This is from a book in 2012 by Tony Charles in Canada. We're used to talking about the natural ecosystem, about our fish and our fishing quotas. We're not used to talking about how the natural ecosystem has feedbacks with the management system So when we set a fishing quota and it's implemented, and the politics of sharing fishing quotas, the politics of negotiating fishing quotas, and how that connects to the human system. So you have community, consumers, households, people who are eating fish, people who are processing fish, people who are fixing boats that fishermen use. This is all integrated, and you can only approach this when you're talking about interdisciplinary science. Each of these three systems has quantifiable data that we can get. And if you want to look at fisheries and manage the ocean sustainably, you must not forget this complexity. We're not going to solve the sustainability issues in our ocean by only looking at the natural ecosystem, so which has been the status quo the last 50 years. So that's our model revolution. You figure out what you really need. We need a systems view. We need to incorporate the data from different parts, not just the biological system. And then in the Kuhn cycle, in this book in 1962, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he talks about paradigm change is the next step. He's the one who coined the term paradigm shift, if you've probably heard of that. And in order to get a paradigm change in science, you have to get some sort of consensus. And this is what is kind of missing, and this is what I want to put forward as a missing link. Let me just show you this dichotomy between normal science and post-normal science, is the term I'm going to introduce right now. Normal science is what I've just been alluding to. This is Thomas Kuhn's definition: puzzle solving, relatively routine work of scientists experimenting within a paradigm and never really challenging that paradigm. They're just doing their day-to-day work. Whereas post-normal science, by my colleagues Silvio Funktowitz and Jerry Ravitz, who are, Silvio's still a professor. He's been all over the world, but now he's landed in Bergen, which is exciting for us. And Jerry Ravitz, who just retired. In the early 90s, they put forward this post-normal science as a methodology of inquiry when cases, and for cases where facts are uncertain, values are in dispute, stakes are high, and decisions are urgent. Now, the poster child for post-normal science is climate science, right? You have very uncertain models, uncertain predictions. At the same time, values are in dispute. Who is going to pay? For example, the stakes are high, and the decisions are urgent. We must make decisions today if we're going to get on the sustainable path. But since values are embedded in science, post-normal science should integrate stakeholders in an extended peer community. The extended peer community means that sometimes the questions scientists are asked when having to advise policy are not scientific questions. They're questions based on values, based on objectives for society. And this is the post-normal paradigm. This is where you have to get different people around the same table to discuss this. So in this diagram, you have on the x-axis systems uncertainty from low to high, and decision stakes on the y-axis from low to high. And that green area in the bottom left-hand corner is where you have applied science. This is the physics envy, where you have low systems uncertainty, but the decision stakes aren't very big. Professional consultancy is the next level, and post-normal science is this area where systems uncertainty is high, and as well as the decision stakes. Okay, so now I've introduced the idea of post-normal science, and maybe you think, okay, that could be right, but what does it actually look like? You can put it into pictures. Normal science, a la Kuhn, is this poor woman under all her papers, is academic. It's monodisciplinary, technocratic, certain and predictive, whereas post-normal science is academic and social. It's transdisciplinary, participative, uncertain, and exploratory. And you have people around the table, different experts from different disciplines, also including the stakeholders and politicians. So perhaps one of the reasons that we've had so much trouble managing our natural renewable resources and climate change, for example, is that it's hard for us to admit that science cannot give us the one answer. Even if we had all the best data in the world, we still have values and other social concerns at stake, which are not necessarily scientific questions. Okay, so I gave you a little bit of background, and I'm going to now focus more specifically on oceans. And here are some illustrations by my friend and colleague Mariano Colentes, who's at the University of Valencia. in Spain to kind of illustrate the problems that we have from an ocean and fisheries perspective. So this is a music box. And one thing that we learn from studying ecosystems and giving ecosystem-based advice is the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Now I put the whole as a capital W. And when I talk about the ocean, I use a capital O. And this is because this is one word that's encompassing very many things. In a music box, you can break it down to its parts, but you can never necessarily guess from its parts when you turn the crank and the music comes out, how that affects you as a person. What joys or what turmoils or what everything that you get from that music. Kind of illustrating the sum is greater than the sum of the parts. Now, here's our history lesson. We're going to go all the way back to the French Revolution. And this train of thought is coming from the professor emeritus at Harvard, E.O. Wilson. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's still living. He's approaching 90. He has a book from 1998 called Consilience, The Unity of Knowledge. And he explains in the introduction of the book that we can really blame a lot of our scientific problems on the French Revolution. And let me quickly explain that. Before the French Revolution, you had a monarchy, right? All the different scientists in the kingdom were reporting to one person, the king. So if the king had a grand challenge or a problem or something that he wanted to fix or find out, for example, I want to have the best wine in all of the kingdoms. So he would put his biologists, his scientists, his philosophers, his economists, all at work for that one single purpose. And so the biologist would have to make the perfect vineyards. The economists would have to figure out how to do it efficiently to scale it up. The philosophers would have to think, oh, what makes the best wine and all this type of things. But at the end of the day, they were reporting to one person. So it was a unity of knowledge. After the French Revolution, they cut the king's head off, cut Marie Antoinette's head off, and now the political system is more democratic. It's more flat. It's not this top-down hierarchical system. And the disciplines in science became very disciplined, which was great because we had huge advances in math, in biology, genetics, all of these different things. But in the 21st century, we're still thinking, okay, that's great that we know how to sequence DNA and do all this stuff. Great. Where's the cure for cancer? How are we going to get there? Because what we know is the grand challenges that we have today in society, climate change and all these things, it's not up to one discipline. You must have a unity of knowledge. So after the French Revolution, the disciplines separated from the whole. And we got a very disciplined view of science. Here's a picture of a fisherman looking through a little peephole as an illustration that the ocean is very vast. If we just use biology in our limited views of how we can look at the ocean, we're not getting the whole system. We're too disciplined. And this leads us to very confused and frustrated decision makers. Here you have a decision maker who has 3 different scientists telling him 3 different things, 3 different sources of data, what's going on. The decision maker then makes the decision based on the stakeholder or the scientist who yells the loudest or whom he trusts the most, and we get politics not necessarily based on a collective view of science. So there's a call for consilience of knowledge, which means unity of knowledge, moving towards interdisciplinary and systems view of the whole. This is the picture of postnormal science. This is where you have your biologist, your politician, your philosopher, your fisherman, your economist, all around the same table. It's a very iterative process. Many, many meetings. The thing is that you have to drive, the system has to be driven that everybody is in on this game of getting together and talking and talking and talking and talking and discussing how we put these together, what data is useful for us, and all these things. Okay, let's get a little bit towards solutions. I think it's important to have this idea that, okay, if there's a will, there's a way. We have tons of data. If there's one thing that we do well, it's collect data. And I'm going to show you some examples of the type of data that we collect in fisheries and ocean management. But it's very important that we have this idea of the focus imaginarius. The 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant describes the focus imaginarius as such. It is something that you know very well what it looks like. It's the perfect picture. It's the perfect ocean managed perfectly. Everybody's perfectly happy. It's what you can imagine could happen, and it's your focus. You're not naive to think that you're ever going to get there, but you must have some sort of goal to go towards. So I'm going to show you 3 steps on will and way. So as will gets higher and way gets higher, you get closer to your focus imaginarius. So first, let's talk about status quo. What do we do today when we are giving fishing advice and managing the ocean? This is taken from the ICES, so it's ICES. It stands for the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea. ICES is the world's oldest intergovernmental organization. It's over 100 years old and collects all the data in Europe with some collaboration with Canada and the United States, and does the science, does the stock assessments to give the fishing advice. Now, there's no real political will for an integrated assessment. The politicians don't know how they would use it, basically. So ICES keeps doing status quo single stock assessment and derives their advice. This is the popularized sheet that they give out for each stock. There's a lot more sheets, or the whole assessment working group report could be from 100 to 200 pages long, but they give this sheet as a popularized version. This is for cod in the North Sea. For 2014, the advice was that based on the EU-Norway plan, the landings in 2014 should be no more than 28,809 tons, which happens to be 9% less than the 2013 total allowable catch. Okay, what does this mean? 28,809 tons. Here we have 5 significant digits. So you might think that the science of stock assessment is really quite certain. Okay, well, they really know what they're talking about. For 1 year, they can fish that much, and this is going to result in sustainable fishing. The fact of the matter is, this is very, very sloppy work on how we give advice. There's no way we could ever have 5 significant digits of certainty. This is, I call it sloppy, but this is just routine. This is how they've been doing it for 20 years. This is what the policymakers expect. This has been negotiated. This is what is done. That's as a basis of a whole nother talk that I just gave at Woodstoll. So I'm starting to do something about this. But we have to be serious about what science can give us and what science can't give us. Science can't give us that certainty, and we have to be honest with our policymakers on what science can do and not do. It's part of the Occupy Science movement that I will allude to a little bit later. Okay, so getting a little bit more will to do an integrated assessment and a little bit combining more data sources. I have this paper from 2009 that you might actually recognize this map. So here we are in Cambridge, and here off the coast of Massachusetts in Cape Cod is George's Bank. Maybe you've heard of George's Bank. Used to be one of the most productive fishing areas in the world. People have been fishing there for over 1,000 years. In George's Bank, you have a really interesting dynamic at the current moment right now. I have overlaid this map on some of the data from NOAA. I'm just going to explain the axes really quickly. The x-axis here is your biomass from, this is the data from 2007, and this is over the biomass at maximum sustainable yield. MSY is our term there. So basically from 0 to a lot. And this is, on the y-axis, our fishing mortality rate. This is how much fishing is happening in proportion, where you have 0 fishing here and a lot. So in this area where it's red, the fish that are plotted, each of these little dots is a fish stock from George's Bank. In this area, the fish plotted here are overfished, and overfishing is occurring. Whereas down here, where you have a lot of biomass and not a lot of fishing happening, these stocks are not overfished, and overfishing is not occurring. So what you have here on George's Bank, you have George's Bank haddock here. This is what it looks like. You have a surplus. We still have a surplus on George's Bank of haddock. But George's Bank cod and yellowtail flounder are overfished and overfishing is occurring, which means the fishermen want to target haddock and leave the cod and yellowtail to be. However, they cannot do this because the technology, the gear technology, when they're dragging the otter trawl, the net, along the sea bottom and destroying a lot of habitat in their wake, they're catching cod and yellowtail as a bycatch of haddock. They cannot just only target haddock until relatively recently. And let me just explain, this is why I wanted to have a mic that moves, because this is where I get to use my hands a little bit. The haddock, this is where biology comes. When the trawl, this is the trawl, the net, when it's being dragged along the seafloor, the reaction, the biological reaction for haddock is to swim up, okay? It doesn't want to go in the net, they're not that dumb, and it swims up. Whereas the cod and the yellowtail swim down along the floor. These are all bottom creatures. So some fishermen and some scientists got this good idea, and they created the rule trawl, which is basically the same thing as an otter trawl, but they just lift it 1 yard off the bottom of the seafloor. That way, as the net is coming, and then it's not being dragged along the seafloor, as they usually are, the cod and the yellowtail will dive down, and the haddock will dive up and be caught. So you can catch them. And this is really interesting, where you can use gear technology from an ecological perspective and from an economic perspective. We want to target the haddock. There's also the separator trawl, which does essentially the same thing. The cod and the yellowtail flounder go down here and they go outside the net, whereas the haddock, they go up and they get into what we call the cod end, the part of the net where they're caught. So I wanted to do an analysis for the fishermen, because they were skeptical about changing their gear to the rule trawl. They didn't know how it was going to work. They didn't know if they're going to get their yields and their money. So we put together the biological data and the stock assessments we had for all 9 stocks that we have data for in the Georges Bank. And we have the profitability surveys and the economic data from some of the economists at NOAA. And we can show these trade-offs, right? Because unless we have the biological data and the employment data and the economic data together, we can't show trade-offs to the, coherently show trade-offs to the policymakers. So here for the 3 different lines, or the 3 different trawls, I won't get into so many details, but the point of the matter is here, where you're getting lots of yield and lots of producer surplus, which is a proxy for profit, you have the trade-off of the different other stocks. These are the mixed species of the bycatch stocks going down. And so we can look at different amount of days at sea. So if we would take, for example, we can look at status quo and see the results on the results in deployment, and the results to the ecosystem. This is just an example of what could be done. I took this paper to the Massachusetts State House in 2009 to State Senator Bruce Tarr, who said, oh, it's great that you scientists are actually using those socioeconomic assessments that NOAA always does, but it's never combined with the biological ones. So there's a little bit of work there, but we can go a little bit further. This is some work that I'm in the process of, where we're trying to look at stakeholder conflicts, because there's a large amount of stakeholders are interested in fisheries. And how do we find the management strategy that is going to satisfy the most amount of stakeholders? That's a very, very interesting question. Very little work is done that usually quantifies utility functions for stakeholders for vast variety. So this is some work that we've pioneered. These are examples of stakeholders. Up here you have your industrial fishermen. You have 2 different representatives of society. This is from a Norwegian context, where we have the Norwegian fisheries minister, who was from the right party, who wanted profitable fisheries, big boats, kind of this, profit-centered rhetoric, and after him was the first female fisheries minister in Norway. She was representing a lot of minorities at the same time when she was appointed fisheries minister from the Labour Party. She was not only a woman, was the first woman there, she was of Sami descent from the Lapland country in the north of Norway, and she was pregnant. So that was cool. And her political philosophy was that all of Norway, which has one of the largest coastlines in the world, should be lit up with fishing villages. We want to put an emphasis on employing people, had the cultural value of fisheries and whatnot. Then you have environmentalists like Maren Esmark at WWF in Oslo, who has different utility coming out of the fishery. And then you have your small-scale coastal fishermen, your artisanal fishermen. And you have what's coming out of the fishery are what we call utility components, like yield, profit, employment at sea, employment at shore, and ecosystem preservation is also has value coming out of the fishery. And basically, you can just put, you can make a utility function on how strong are the preferences for each stakeholder on these different components that we can get out. And then you would quantify what we call the area of joint satisfaction. So let's say in this, this is a generic showing the results for stakeholder A for different management strategies. And in this blue zone, they would be getting, for example, 90% of their maximum utility. So they're pretty happy in that area. Stakeholder B would be getting, for example, 90% in this area. And then just simply overlap them and talk about an area of where you can start the negotiations. So you're already starting with some sort of a consensus. In order, this is avoiding where you're starting from scratch and people are just going to butt heads and not agree. So this is what we've quantified. We call it the assessment of joint stakeholder satisfaction, where we combine the data from the different data sources, from the biology and from the employment and economic model. And then we integrate utility components, get stakeholder-specific total utility, and then get what we call the JSS, the joint stakeholder satisfaction. This is not routinely done. This is important to realize because we don't even do integrated assessments on the scale. There's scientists around the world that are getting their fingers wet and starting to do it, but we definitely don't do it on a large-scale political value, the political scale of which is needed. This is the one result I'm going to show you from this. We did this, quantified it for Barents Sea capelin, which is a small pelagic fish that's sold on the Japanese market for human consumption. This is a schooling fish, and we did it for cod, North Atlantic cod, which is a much bigger, longer-lived fish, to see if there were differences. I'm going to break it down because this is a pretty heavy figure. On the x-axis, we have harvest proportion from 0 to almost 100% fishing. And now we're doing this in a simulation, computer simulation model, so we can actually do all parameter space and look at it. And on the y-axis, you have the minimum size of capture. So you guys are probably familiar that if you're recreational fishing and your fish is smaller than the minimum size, you have to throw it back. So now we're simulating minimum size of the whole spectrum for capelin that only gets to be about 18 centimeters, and cod, which gets to be about this big. For each data point, so each combination of harvest proportion, for example, say you have 20% harvest proportion and 2 centimeters minimum size, that represents a strategy. So you would fish this amount and you wouldn't fish them until they're this big. For each of these data points, we plot for each of these data management strategies, all 5 stakeholders have their utility value. How much utility from their utility function are they getting with that strategy? And now we're getting into a little bit of philosophy. We're not going to plot all 5 of those stakeholders, because if we follow the maxi-min principle by John Rawls, who was a famous 20th century philosopher, he said the measure of a society is how they take care of the least advantaged citizen, right? Which is a really nice philosophy. I think a lot of people can agree on that. So in that case, we have the results of the 5 stakeholders. We only plot the stakeholder who does the worst, okay? We assume that we want to take care of that stakeholder and looking for the consensus. We're not concerned we're concerned when everybody is happy, not just 2 or 3 people or 1 person. So this star represents where all the stakeholders receive their maximum utility based on the weakest link, basically, which shows that we're fishing a lot, but at very large sizes, because these circles represent the status quo and where we manage fisheries today for cod. We manage them around 38% harvest proportion, and the minimum size is 45 centimeters. This is really interesting. It's hard to know how much trust. I've done a lot of uncertainty analyses on this, and we're still doing this. The fact of the matter is we get very different results. The status quo management is based on the biological assessment. This star is based on the biosocioeconomic assessment, including stakeholder values and what they value in the fishery. This is giving us different results, which I think means that we need to look closer at this, because perhaps we're not even managing to what the majority of stakeholders actually want, right? This is a post-normal question. We have to get people around the table using the philosopher Mary Pucker Follett, who is my favorite philosopher. You should Google her. She's really, really cool. She was born and raised in Massachusetts in the late 1800s and did a lot of political management theory and how to resolve conflicts. She says that unless you have diverse stakeholders around the table and they get to reevaluate their objectives, so you have one iteration of stakeholders and they say what they want, and then you do that again and again and again until they can realize, where is the integrated solution going to come from? It has to come from us. How is it going to get there? So this is all towards the area of the focus imaginarius, where we want to be. We have to start making small steps to get there. So that's some work that I have done, and I want to put it also in a little bit different perspective as well. Let me kind of sum up before I go to the part where I show you some cool data stuff. This is kind of part of the Occupy Science movement, because I find a lot of the scientific ethos being very important here. So I'm a biologist and I collect data, but I understand that the employment data in the fishery is really quite important. I understand the power of the policymakers to put forward science. So I want to put this forward as how can we save the ocean? Unless we educate our students to see the whole with the big W, they'll never understand how their discipline, how their knowledge fits into the whole, right? So this is getting a little bit back, bridging the gap that we got from the French Revolution. It's very good to have disciplined scientists. That's great. This is technology. This is advancement. But we can't do that to the expense of the grand challenges that we have: climate change, natural renewable resource management. Once they understand how they fit into the whole, you can have cooperation among disciplines to understand the whole, and then to use the data in integrated platforms and extended peer community, this is relating to post-normal science, to inform science-driven policy, not policy-driven science. Again, this is a little bit of the Occupy Science movement, where you have to stand up for what science can do and what it can't do, and actually look at that. Okay, this is the last part, where I come with some brainstorming ideas that me and my colleagues in Bergen, and actually I had colleagues from all over the world that had some ideas here. How could Google help save the ocean? What do we do with data now? This is the DNAnexus.com project that Google Ventures heavily invested in. This is quite fascinating. So this is basically putting all the data that we have on DNA sequencing up in the cloud, so people can access it, look for new clues in the DNA, look for new, if you're looking for personalized medicine, all this type of thing, where you have all these public databases of data going into the DNA Nexus cloud. Their office is in Mountain View, so there's probably some people who have maybe heard of this. So basically, you're putting everything up in the cloud, and you can use your research community, for example, your biologist, your statistician, other collaborators, to combine all of this data, look at different analyses, and get results that you couldn't have gotten otherwise through a network. It's fascinating. It's really easy to see how you would apply this to fish and oceans, because we only have one ocean. That's why I have ocean with a capital O. And so everything is inherently interconnected. We must remember that. This is an example I was referring to ICES, the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea. There's over 1,600 scientists that routinely every year meet in working groups. This is an overview of some of the data that they have. For example, They have almost 700,000 measurements from the biological community over 34 years. You have from the oceanographic data, you have 245 million data points over 122 years. So we collect a lot of data. That's all publicly available. WWF has been doing something really interesting in the Arctic. So they have, this is a map of the Arctic. So here's Greenland. This is the eastern coast of North America. And here's Iceland. Here's some data that they have. For example, you click on a fish that you want. And this data is actually showing all species and their relative probabilities of occurrence in these areas. And so you have a lot of different data that's kind of overlayered each other. It's interesting. Yeah, it's kind of, for me, kind of a toy to look around. It's not very, very scientific, especially when you're talking about relative probabilities, blah, blah, blah. But you could do it during different seasons and all these things, and you can get a picture of the fish that you want. It's really cool, and it's showing that unless we can start mapping the Arctic, we can't really divvy it up politically. We can't really study it. It's become a very big political issue, for example, between US, Canada, USA, Norway, and Russia, right? Who is going to own these shipping lanes that are freeing up with the ice? Here's a paper that my colleague Nils-Olof Handegård has published a couple of years ago, talking about how we're collecting data. This is a really cool thing that the technology is there now. When we're at sea, this is our research boat GeoSARS. It's the world's most advanced research vessel at my Institute of Marine Research in Norway. We can see below, using acoustic methods, what fish are there, and we can sample them. So we can match up our acoustic sampling with the actual sample. For example, we have data, we can put these sounders on cruise ships. So whenever they're going back and forth for wherever they're going around the world, they can also be picking up continuous data. But Nils-Olof has pioneered, we have these missiles that they have in California, which is really cool, that they cost a lot. They're multi-million-dollar little things, but you can shoot them in the ocean and they just are collecting data all over. There's people that spend their whole careers on this, so I'm not doing it that much justice. But one thing that Nils-Olof has done are these sounders that are in the seabed of the floor that are collecting data 24/7 on data like a salinity, turbidity, but also fish acoustics, what schools are passing, species identification. The thing that is bad about the ships is that the fish avoid the ships, right? They don't want to get near them, they're loud, they're clunky, and they know they're going to get caught. Whereas if you have these passive data collectors, this is a really good way to do it. The problem being, once we get this data, how do we share it? Where's a common platform? We're really good at collecting data. We're really bad about sharing it and knowing what type of, how do we integrate it? So if the Norwegian public has paid for this, why should they share it with the rest of the world? So that's what we're really missing is a common platform and people who understand these data platforms. This is the last data thing I want to show you. This is really cool data. This is, again, coming from WWF. This is data coming from a single bluefin tuna. Bluefin tuna is the iconic species of the ocean. It's my favorite fish. It spawns in the Mediterranean, crosses the Atlantic to the Caribbean to start feeding up the eastern seaboard. It crosses again, and it's now up in Norway again. It has been an endangered species for a while. Now it has rebounded, partly because of political measures. Finally, they have stopped a lot of the overfishing. So pretty soon it might be okay again to eat bluefin tuna, which is really cool. So anyway, bluefin tuna is a fantastic swimmer. This is where they tagged, so you can tag them. You can like shoot a little tag in its back, kind of like what in I guess in Jaws. Isn't there where they shoot a harpoon? But this is you just shoot it like a dart. And this is in the Mediterranean, Palma de Mallorca, off the coast of Spain. And you start getting all these pings about where it's actually going. And this red spot is where it popped off. So this was data, I think, from 7 or 8 days. And you can do this. There's all these other cool things that you can do with the data. The crux of it being, okay, where do we put the data? How do we access it? How do we make sure the right people get access to this data to actually do something meaningful with it? So if we go back to our issue, how can we sustainably manage the ocean? I put forward the power of data and the power of getting an extended peer community around the table to not just talk about data, but also to talk about values, because there's a difference between science for science and science for policy. Occupying science so we know what science can actually give us and what it can't. And I would open up the floor if anybody has any questions or comments, and looking forward to hearing what you think. Thanks a lot. Can entertain any, is there anything that was unclear I could reiterate?
I had a question about that one chart that you showed with the cod and another kind of fish. You had the star and the circle. Mm-hmm. Now, the circle was what the current fishing is, mm-hmm. and the star is, and that was to represent what would satisfy all stakeholders. Yeah. And one thing I didn't understand, so it was looking for like more, for basically harvesting bigger fish. Yeah. And I didn't quite understand how that would satisfy more stakeholders.
Yeah, that satisfies most stakeholders because the bigger the fish, the more profit you receive. The bigger the fish, the more you're waiting to fish until they get big, which is preserving the ecosystem. And
that would satisfy fishermen? That presumably means they would have to fish less now than wait for these fish to get bigger, right?
Yeah, so there's a different temporal timescales here, and there's also the investment. So they've made major investments to fish them at the current size, because to buy new nets and to change the mesh size is a very large investment. So that shows that in this idealized world where they put preference on profit, a little bit more in the industrial fishermen putting a little bit more preference on profit than yield, right? Because there's a difference between profit and catch. Because you can get a lot of catch, but you could have used almost all your resources to catch that catch, and the selling price will be lower than what you actually put in. So if you focus on profit, usually you have maximum profit before you have maximum yield. So then it could, if you focus on profit, you're focusing on size. You get a lot, I mean, especially like, you know, if you talk about tuna on the Japanese market, a bluefin tuna like this is not worth anything, right? A bluefin tuna that's 2 meters long could be worth $1 million. So there's a lot of these dynamics that until you start modeling it and looking at the trade-offs, you don't really understand behavioral patterns. But if they put their behavior and they want profit, you get different results than if they want yield. Yeah. It's different for each fishery, but yeah, in this case, that was the case. Yeah?
Could you say something about the difference between going around and figuring out what everyone's interests are and then doing all of this work to figure out what would be the best thing versus getting them together to listen to each other and figure it out together?
Yeah, there's a big difference. So the philosopher I mentioned, Mary Parker Follett, who I just think is cool, she says that there's very different psychological behaviors that are going on. If I'm a scientist, if I go to everybody's office by myself and say, okay, what do you want? Fill out this questionnaire, what do you want in the fishery? And I go to 20 different stakeholders and do that. Combine that. Then I do the simulations and I say, okay, this is what you guys wanted. They see the results and they might say, no, I didn't really mean that. In climate change science, there's a big difference between the preferences that they state, their stated preferences, and their revealed preferences. So I might say that I'm all for helping climate change, but at the end of the day, I'm still buying my ticket to San Francisco for a 3-day vacation because my revealed preference is actually different than what I state. So it's important, she says, to get people around the table and give them a chance to reevaluate their positions according to the positions of other people. So you get different fishermen and say, okay, what do you want out of the fishery? And he says, I want to catch a lot of fish. Then the next fisherman, you ask him, and he says, I want a 10% profit margin. And then the guy next to him is like, oh, that sounds good. I think I want that too, right? And then he's like, so as a scientist, what's the difference between maximum yield and 10% profit margin in my fishery? And they say, actually, you would catch less. You'd have more vacation days. You would have more money. And then all of a sudden, if he had not been in the room when the other people stated their preferences, he wouldn't see different options. And you can't look for an integrated solution unless those people are there around at the same time.
So how do you get them together?
You get them together through, for example, research projects. We have research projects where we have stakeholder consultation and stakeholder workshops, stakeholder framing meetings. This has become really a la mode in Europe at the moment. So I have a lot of colleagues that get, the European Commission is paying for this type of science to be done. We still have to make the bridge to actual politics and actual decision making based on these type of workshops. We're not there yet, because at the end of the day, it's still some people in Brussels who are going to decide what the fishing quota is, and they do this behind closed doors. So we have to show the methodology in practice and really push hard for that. That's, I think, the way you have to go.
Yeah. So how do you weight stakeholders? Some of them are more important than others, right? The recreational fishermen or the aborigines or something might not step there with the big fishing, local fishing.
Yeah, so this is a big question, and this is where you go, I mean, this is a question for political science, for anthropologists, social scientists. Who gets to sit at the table, right? Because that's a big commitment to sit at the table, because if it's an iterative process, you have to have the funds to actually be there. You have to have knowledge to actually participate, and yeah, it's a time and an economic commitment. There's not one answer. It depends on the fishery. And again, this is a political question. This isn't, science can help. So science can, for example, social scientists can say who the main players have been the last 10 years based on their attendance at different meetings or profits coming from the fishery, how many people they employ in the fishery and these type of things. But yeah, usually what's done in Europe, we have the regional advisory councils, which is the meeting of the stakeholders for the different regions of Europe. They sign up, right? And what we see is there's an overflow of industrial fishermen and fishermen representatives, and not very many conservationists, because they're spread thin. They can't send somebody to Copenhagen every 6 weeks to have the meeting. So you don't see a real democracy there. It's still the people with the money who are participating in the stakeholders. So that's a question for democracy, actually. Is that how it should be? Yeah.
So in that chart that you showed where the star was on the optimal fishing, I noticed it was a 100% take at a certain size. Is that in any way practical?
It's not quite 100% because of, the practicalities are really disputable about that. It depends on the fishery. So if you're waiting for first of all, it would take this is when you talk about paradigm change, that for the fishermen to wait until the cod is this big to catch, it's not even on the radar, right? They mature when they're about this big. Science has shown that there's tendencies for, we're actually seeing the fish evolve in front of our eyes. The last 40 years, cod has been maturing at 9 years of age, and now because the fishing mortality is many more times the natural mortality, they're spawning sooner because they know that they're going to get caught. So now they're spawning at 5, 6, so they're shrinking. It's a shrinking fish. And this has ethical considerations too, because we're changing their biology just because of the fishing pressure. So it's not really on the fisherman's radar to wait till they're this big, even though ecologically and from a profit standpoint, it could. So I mean, the practicalities are up to debate. I presented this to 200 Norwegian fishermen, and it wasn't really on the radar. They understand the concept, and again, that result, I don't put much trust in that result per se. We would have to do many more different types of analysis to get some real certainty of that, okay, can we trust this somewhat or not? the fact of the matter is that we have all the data, we just have to do it, and this is just showing an outline of how you can incorporate stakeholder utility functions and look for strategies that satisfy as many people. So the practicalities are up to the fishermen and what they're willing to change, and policymakers, because they have, at the end of the day, they have to put objectives on the table. What are they actually trying to achieve? If they're going for profitability, then okay, we can show those trade-offs for the other systems. But yeah, having a framework where you can show trade-offs is of utmost importance, because that's what you have to do at the end of the day, is to make some decisions. Thanks a lot for having me.